Hey guys, we are going to continue with our factoring quadratics unit today. We have one last way to factor a quadratic. Before we jump into that, I wanted to review really quickly some of the things that we've already talked about when we factor quadratics. So number one is one of the problems that we looked at last week, where you look at this number as the product and this number as the sum. And so you ask yourself, what two numbers can I come up with that has a product of negative 35 and a sum of positive 2? And those two numbers would be positive 7 and negative 5. So you would factor this quadratic as x plus 7 and x minus 5. So again, you can multiply this back and make sure it takes you to the original quadratic. So yesterday we looked at the difference of squares, or actually that was today's we looked at the difference of squares. So this is where you don't have a middle term, you just have two terms, they're subtracted, and this is a square number, meaning that there's a 1 right there, which is a square, and 121 is a perfect square. So we can factor that out pretty simply. We're going to put an x here and put an x here. Think of what number times itself as 121, and that's 11. And in order for that to be a negative 121 and there to be no term in the middle, that has to be a positive 11 and a negative 11. And when you multiply that out, that middle term zeroes out, so you're just left with those two terms. So that's a really quick review of some problems we've already done. So today, we're going to look at factoring quadratics when a is not 1. And what that means is your leading coefficient in a quadratic is represented by the variable a. So far in most of the problems that we've done, the way we've worked on them, this number has been 1. So we need to look at what happens when this is not 1 and it's not the difference of squares. So in number 1, we have 2x squared minus 7x plus 3. You need to think about how this is your ax squared plus or minus bx plus or minus c. So that's where the a, b, and c come in. There is a method to doing this called the AC method. Okay? So here's what this means. I've drawn this little x, and this x is a tool that we're going to use to break apart this middle term so we can begin to factor that. So this AC means you're going to multiply your a term and your c term together. So when I multiply my a term and my c term together, that's a 6. My b term is negative 7, and so that goes right there, okay? Now, here's what we need to think of next. What gives me a product of 6 and a sum of negative 7? So it kind of brings back in that concept that we looked at last week. So you want to think of what two numbers can I multiply together to get a positive 6 and add together to get a negative 7. And those two numbers are minus 6 and minus 1. Negative 6 and negative 1. Now, once you're done with that, you don't need this part of this little diagram anymore. Because what this tells us is how to break apart this middle term right here. So I'm going to expand this out into 2x squared minus 6x minus 1x plus 3. So what I did, I split that apart into the two terms that we get to equal that. So that's the whole purpose of this whole this AC method, is to find out what two numbers we need to split this apart. Now, when you have that, you are going to split this apart into two binomials, and you're going to pull the greatest common factor out of those two binomials. So that's when we did the GCF a couple weeks ago. So the biggest thing I can pull out of 2x squared and a minus 6x is 2x. And when you do that, you are left with x minus 3. So I factored that out, okay? Now, you want this second factor to look like this. So I want you to think, what could you factor out of negative x plus 3 to make it x minus 3? And the answer to that is to factor out a -1. If you factor out a -1 from -1x, that becomes positive x. And when you factor out a -1 from +3, that becomes a -3. These two should be the same once you factored it out. Now, so here's what you have. You're going to put these two GCFs together. That becomes one of your binomials. And then this common binomial becomes your second. So, the factored form of 2x squared minus 7x plus 3 is 2x minus 1 times x minus 3. You can double check that by doing the FOIL method or doing distributive property and making sure this takes you back to your original trinomial. Okay, so we're going to try this again for number 2. Here's what I notice. I'm trying to factor this out, and I note that this is not 1. So if your leading coefficient is not 1, that's when we have to do this AC method. All right, so right here, I'm going to put the number that I get when I multiply positive 6 and -2. That's going to be a -12. And I'm just going to put my B term right there, and that's just x. So that just means the coefficient is 1 right there. And when I say multiply them together, you're just multiplying the coefficients together. You're not multiplying the entire term. So here's what I'm asking you. What gives me a product of -12 and a sum of +1? And that's going to be a +4 and a -3. 4 times -3 is -12. 4 plus -3 is -1. And again, what I'm doing with this is breaking this middle term down into 2 separate terms. So now I don't need this and I don't need this, so I'm going to rewrite this polynomial using this instead of the x. So it's going to be 6x squared plus 4x minus 3x minus 2. And again, this should equal that. So if you did 4x minus 3x, it should equal that 1x. Okay. So now I'm going to split these up into 2 binomials, and I'm going to pull the GCF, or greatest common factor, out of both of those binomials. So if I have 6x squared plus 4x, the biggest factor that I can pull out is 2x. And what's going to be left in there after I factor out a 2x is going to be 3x plus 2. So again, I divided both of these by 2x. Okay. Remember, we want that second binomial to look like the first binomial. It's already really similar because you have a 3x and a 2, but your signs are wrong. So if I factor out a -1, -3x divided by -1 is +3x. -2 divided by -1 is +2. So now these 2 binomials match, and that's what you want. These 2 GCFs that I pulled out make my first binomial, so that's going to be 2x minus 1, and then that common binomial that I had remaining is my second term, or second binomial. So the factored form of 6x squared plus x minus 2 is 2x minus 1 and 3x plus 2. Okay. I know this is very complicated. It's going to take a little bit of practice. It's not something you're going to jump right into and feel confident right away. So please look at the YouTube videos. I am posting this video, and then I'm going to post a second video by another teacher that may do a better job of explaining it or might say something that clicks with you in a different way. So there's 2 different options for you to look on today. There are also copies of notes and examples. There's several, many more than just the 2 that I gave you. I think there's 5 or 6 examples. Come to Zoom. I will help you work out every single one of these. If you come into the Zoom session, we can work them out together. So look at your email for the invitation. Let me know if you have any questions. Watch the YouTube videos. Look at the notes. Don't just go to the assignment. And I will see you guys tomorrow. Thank you.